evening, Bio 12, and we're moving on to the second part of the respiratory system. So we're going to be talking about the mechanisms of breathing. So what is the big picture idea for this? By the end of the class, you should be able to, by the end of the lesson, you should be able to answer 2 questions. You should be able to tell me, how do we breathe? So what allows us to bring in and out air? And what controls our breathing? So what regulates the mechanism of how we breathe? So before we get started, we need to look at some different parts, and we're looking at their structure and function. So starting with the diaphragm is a muscle, so the structure is a muscle. This is the muscle below our rib cage, and when it contracts, it's going to pull down our ribs, allowing air to come in. So the function, it's going to help bring in and out air. Intercostals. So these are the muscles between our ribs. So again, structure, muscles between our ribs, and hopefully not to ruin it for anybody, but when you're eating Maui ribs or you go to a restaurant and you're eating ribs, this is what you're eating. So the ribs muscles are also going to contract. This is going to pull up and out our rib cage, and again, air can flow in. So again, our function, same as the diaphragm, it's going to help bring in and out air. Pleural membrane, so this is basically a sac that encases the lungs and contains fluid. So membranous sac around lungs and with fluid. So the purpose of this fluid is going to decrease friction. So the reason why we want to decrease friction is because when we're breathing in and out, our lungs, the fluid allows our lungs to slide against one another, which is going to decrease the amount of abrasion that happens. Another reason why we have the pleural membrane is to keep our lungs airtight. So that's why if one of our lungs is punctured, we are still able to breathe because the other one isn't affected by this because it's in that airtight container. We also have stretch receptors. We've talked about these before in our alveoli, not so much focusing on the structure, but their functions. So when air is maxed out in our alveoli, so sends message to prevent overfilling. So now that we know the parts, we're going to look at how they work together to help us breathe. So the mechanism of how we breathe, there's 2 ways how we breathe. One is inhalation. So this is breathing in, and breathing in is an active process. And when we say active, we mean using energy. So energy is required for muscle contractions when we're breathing in, and we're looking at the diaphragm and our intercostal muscles. So when we breathe in, our diaphragm is going to contract, and when it contracts, it's going to pull down. When it pulls down, this creates a bigger, more volume in our thoracic cavity. Our intercostal muscles are also going to contract, and they're going to pull the ribs up and out. Again, creating more space in our thoracic cavity for air to come into. So when our diaphragm and our intercostal muscles contract, they are going to increase the volume in our lungs, which is going to decrease the pressure in our lungs. So decreasing the air pressure. So with a lower air pressure, it's going to be lower than our environment outside our body. So air is going to want to move from a high concentration to low concentration, and thus air is going to move into our lungs to equal out this pressure. So we call this negative pressure. So when we look at the exhaling, so Exhalation, breathing out, this is going to be a passive process because our muscles are now relaxing. We don't need the energy to contract them. So our diaphragm is going to relax, and when it relaxes, it's going to move back up, and our intercostal muscles are going to relax, which causes our ribs to move down and in. So both of these, when we relax, we're decreasing the amount of volume in our thoracic cavity, which means we decrease the volume in our lungs. And when we decrease the volume in our lungs, we are now creating a higher air pressure. So this increases pressure in our lungs. Again, the pressure in our lungs is higher than it is in the environment outside. The air wants to now move out of our lungs into the environment to create equilibrium. So this is how we breathe out, and this is called positive air pressure. So again, looking at our diagram, breathing in, our muscles contract and expand our thoracic cavity, which creates a higher volume, or more volume, so air moves in. And when we exhale, our diaphragm and our intercostal muscles relax, creating less volume, and the air then moves out of our lungs. So why can we breathe without having to think about it? This is what we're going to talk about with breathing control. So we control our breathing by chemoreceptors on our medulla oblongata. So this is our center, our region in our brain that we call the breathing center. And we also call this the reflex center because we aren't actually thinking about breathing. If you had to think about breathing, we probably breathe like 20 breaths every minute. So if you had to think 20 times every minute to breathe in and breathe out, you wouldn't be able to get anything out of this lesson. So we find the chemoreceptors on the surface of our medulla oblongata. These are responding to change. So our medulla is going to detect change in carbon dioxide. And when we're talking about changing carbon dioxide, we're not talking about the direct amount of carbon dioxide. We're talking about the amount of hydrogen atoms in our blood. So this is connected, and it's something that we're going to talk about the next day, but for now, we'll just write in our hydrogen atom. So it's detecting change in carbon dioxide or the hydrogen atoms. So if we have a high amount of CO2, our brain sends a signal for us to inhale. Again, our muscles contract, create a higher volume in our thoracic cavity so air can move in. And when we have low amounts of carbon dioxide, our brain is going to send a signal to exhale. So our muscles are then going to relax and our air can move out. We also have the aortic arch and the carotid artery for signaling. These are called secondary receptors because they're not necessarily detecting the amounts of carbon dioxide. They're actually detecting, so they detect oxygen levels, and detecting oxygen levels have a very little influence on our normal breathing mechanism. Therefore, we call them secondary receptors because they don't have as big of an impact. So keeping in mind, carbon dioxide is our signal to breathe in or breathe out. This is a reflex to breathe. We don't have to actually think about it, but we can send a message to our breathing center to stop our breathing. So this is when we hold our breaths. Eventually, though, the medulla oblongata is going to override this message and you have to take a breath. So in summary, how do we breathe? what allows us to bring in air. So this is our positive and negative air pressure. And what controls breathing. So we said carbon dioxide or the H plus levels signal when to inhale and when to exhale. And again, here's a little clip to end your night.
Jingle bells, jingle all the way. Oh, what fun it is to ride